coastline fades into jagged grey line against the darkening horizon. For the men standing on the deck, this is not a journey of grand discovery, but a calculated departure from the warmth of the hearth and the stability of the soil. As the harbour air, thick with the scents of peat smoke and damp earth, gives way to biting metallic tang of the open North Sea, the temperature shift is immediate. It is a slow, creeping sensation, since starts at the fingertips and settles in the marrow. The transition from life on land to life on a medieval vessel, it is a fundamental shift. It is a fundamental shift in how the human body interacts with the environment. In this era, the ships were not the climate-controlled machines of the modern age. They were vast, floating shells of oak and pine, porous and perpetually cold. As the vessel tilts, catching the first of the deep-water swells, the crew begins to feel the unique hostility of the maritime winter. It is not merely a drop in the mercury, it is the wind, a relentless abrasive force that strips heat from the skin faster than any static frost. Standing on the creaking timber, the men pull their tunics tighter, realizing that the survival of the coming weeks depend entirely on how they manage the next few hours of transition. The wood of the ship itself begins to sweat, a cold condensation that beads on the bulkheads, signalling the start of the damp, pervasive environment they will call home. Here there are no luxuries, no hearths, and no escape from the creeping chill. The rhythm of the ship becomes the rhythm of their lives, dictated by the relentless demands of the tides and the unyielding nature of the climate. Each man looks to the next, checking gear and gauging the mood, aware that the sea does not offer second chances to those who arrive unprepared for the cold. The channel's sleepy history with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. Beneath the deck, the atmosphere undergoes a radical transformation. As the men descend in the belly of the ship, the reality of their living condition manifests in the geometry of the hull. These spaces were designed for comfort. They were designed for cargo, ballast, and the structural integrity required to survive the violent pitch of the North Sea. The lower deck, often situated just above the waterline, acts as a heat sink, absorbing the chilling temperatures of the ocean directly through the wooden planking. The seams, caulked with oakum and tar, are never truly airtight. As the ship cuts through the waves, seawater spray is forced in the microscopic gaps between the oak timbers, turning the interior into a perpetually damp cavern. This humidity is the most insidious enemy of the medieval sailor, as moisture conducts heat away from the body nearly 25 times faster than dry air. To live here is to exist in a space that rejects warmth by design. The sleeping quarters, often nothing more than a shared space between the massive ribs of the ship, are cramped, poorly ventilated, and saturated with the scent of salt, wet timber, and unwashed wool. The layout is claustrophobic. Men are forced to tuck them in the smallest possible footprints to preserve what residual heat they can generate. There is no insulation between the outer hull and the sleeping berth, meaning that on nights when the wind howls against the mast, the wood acting as the sailor's barrier is little more than a thin layer of freezing material. The lack of interior partitions means that any cold draft entering from the bow ripples through the entire lower deck, effectively turning the interior into wind tunnel. Understanding the layout is crucial to understanding the survival tactics. The closer one sleeps to the keel, the more they are subject to the icy seepage from below. Yet, moving higher up the ship exposed the individual to the freezing air currents rushing through the hatches. The men learned to read the ship architecture like a map of survival. They identify the dead zones, the corners where stagnant air pools, which, while stuffy, at least retain a fraction more temperature than the high traffic areas near the access ladders. Every beam, every bulkhead, and every iron bolt becomes a conductive path for the outside cold to reach the inside. Watching an experienced sailor navigate these quarters, one notices how they instinctively avoid touching the metal fastens or the outer, most planks during the night. They recognize that these materials have a thermal conductivity that can leach the warmth from a resting body in minutes. In this environment, the ship's structure is not just a vessel, it is a cold, indifferent companion that demands constant vigilance. Survival here is a matter of knowing exactly where the cold hides, how it moves through the ship, and how to position one's body within the wooden ribs to minimize exposure to the encroaching frost. The architecture of the ship is a testament to the era's technical limitations, and for those living within its confines. It is a daily, relentless struggle to remain just warm enough to function when the morning shift begins. The term cold chain in a modern context refers to preserving perishable goods, but for the medieval mariner, it takes on a much more visceral meaning. It is the relentless link of events that leads to a drop in core body temperature. Understanding this chain is the only way to grasp why a sailor might succumb to the elements even when they are not standing directly in the spray of a winter storm. It begins with the convection of the sea air. On deck, the wind is not just moving air, it is a thermal thief. It strips away the thin boundary layer of warm air that the body attempts to maintain against its own skin. When a sailor is working the rigging or adjusting the sail, their movement generates heat. But the moment they stop to tie a knot or observe the horizon, that heat is immediately dissipated by the wind. This is the first link in the chain. Once the body loses this surface warmth, it begins to draw heat from the extremities to protect the core. This is where the physical performance of the medieval sailor begins to decline. Fingers become stiff, making the delicate repetitive work of handling ropes or cleaning deck equipment difficult and dangerous. A mistaken knot or a fumble with a heavy tool can lead to injury, and in the wet, cold environment of a ship, any minor wound is a significant risk. The second link in the cold chain is the inevitable dampness. Even with the best efforts to stay dry, the ambient humidity, often near saturation point, penetrates every layer of clothing. When water touches the skin or saturates the wool, it creates a bridge for heat to escape directly from the body into the surround air or the freezed ship timbers. As the hours of a shift drag on, the body's metabolic rate begins to slow in response to the sustained stress. The shivering reflex, the body's desperate, involuntary attempt to generate heat through muscle contraction, is a double-edged sword. While it produces heat, it also consumes mass amounts of energy and can leave the sailor exhausted. For a crew operating on limited rations of salt meat and hard bread, this energy expenditure is a deficit that cannot be easily recovered. The third link in the chain is the transition to rest. Moving from the active high-exertion environment of the deck to the stagnant cold air of the lower deck is a thermal shock. The body, already struggling to maintain a stable internal temperature, is suddenly plunged into an environment where the ambient temperature might be only a few degrees above freezing. This is why the sailors do not simply lie down and sleep. They must actively prepare their sleeping environment, a process that is as rigorous as any task performed on deck. They know that if they fail to interrupt the cold chain at this stage, they risk the onset of hypothermia, which in the cramped, dark conditions of the ship can go unnoticed until it is far too late. The collective knowledge of how to manage this cold chain is passed down through necessity. There are no manuals, only the observed success or failure of those who have sailed before them. Every sailor learns quickly that the cold is not a static state to be endured, but a dynamic, active force that must be managed through constant, calculate adjustments to their posture, their clothing, and their surroundings. They treat the maintenance of their internal heat with the same seriousness they afford to the navigation of the ship, knowing that both are essential to their survival on the grey, unforgiving waters. The clothing of a medieval sailor was not chosen for fashion or status, but for its utilitarian ability to act as a thermal barrier. The primary material was wool, and for good reason. It remains the most effective insulator, even when damp. Unlike linen or cotton, which lose their ability to trap heat the moment they become wet, wool fibres retain their structure and pockets of air. A sailor's wardrobe was a carefully curated system of layers, designed to move moisture away from the skin while holding heat close to the body. The base layer was often a heavy woolen tunic, coarse and thick, worn directly against the skin. While it might have been itchy and abrasive, it provided the essential first line of defence. Over this, a sailor might wear a secondary tunic or a heavy waistcoat, often fashioned from thicker, felted wool that provided wind resistance. The outer layer was the most critical. It was often a heavy canvas or thick, boiled wool coat treated with natural fats, such as animal tallow or lanolin, to provide a degree of water repellency. This was not a modern raincoat. It would eventually soak through in a prolonged storm, but it delayed the penetration of the ice sea spray significantly. The importance of these layers was not just in their thickness, but in the air spaces created between them. These trapped pockets of air, warmed by the body, formed an insulating envelope that slowed the rate of heat loss to the outside environment. The clothing was also designed for mobility. A sailor needed to climb rigging and heave lines, so layers were fitted to be snug without restricting movement. Gloves and head coverings were often overlooked by the inexperienced, but the seasoned sailor knew they were vital. A wool cap pulled low over the ears prevented the rapid heat loss that occurs through the scalp, a major vulnerability in sub-zero temperatures. Because they rarely had the luxury of changing into dry clothes after a watch, sailors developed the practice of layer management. If a garment became saturated with sea spray, they would try to rotate it, placing the damp layer between two dry ones, allowing the heat of their body to slowly drive the moisture outward through evaporation, a technique that required constant attention. They would also use scraps of leather or extra canvas as makeshift patches on areas prone to wear, such as the elbows and shoulders, adding extra thickness where the wind hit the hardest. There were no synthetic fibres here, no waterproof membranes, only the raw natural properties of the materials available in the medieval world. To keep these garments functional, they had to be kept clean of salt. Salt crystals left behind by sea spray were hygroscopic. They drew moisture from the air, keeping the clothing damp long after the spray had stopped. So during the few moments of calm, you would see men beating the salt out of their tunics against the mast or the bulwarks. It was a chore, but it was an essential part of the routine to prevent the cold from setting in. This system of layering was the primary tool for surviving the maritime winter, a defensive armour against the biting reach of the sea. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes inspired by real events, figures and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. When the sun dips below the horizon and the temperature on the lower deck plummets, the individual becomes a liability to their own survival. This is the moment when the crew moves from individual struggle to a collective strategy, the practice of close proximity huddling. Within the tight curved confines of the ship's hold, there is no space for personal boundaries. These are replaced by the necessity of shared body heat. Sailors would gather in small, designated groups, laying down in a row or in a cluster, pressed shoulder to shoulder, chest to back. This is not a matter of comfort, but a highly effective heat exchange mechanism. By reducing the surface area exposed to the freezing air and pooling their metabolic warmth, the crew creates a microclimate that is significantly more stable than the environment of the rest of the ship. The psychology of this arrangement is just as important as the biology. In the darkness, the sound of rhythmic breathing and the steady warmth of a shipmate act as a psychological anchor, grounding the individual against the howling wind and the groaning of the timber frame. Is an unspoken pact. Each man knows that if he pulls away or refuses to share his space, the entire group loses efficiency. They often share a large communal blanket or heavy woolen cloak, tucking the edges beneath their bodies to trap the rising heat. This human hearth is the only thing standing between them and the debilitating effects of nocturnal cold. The hierarchy of the ship often fades in these sleeping clusters. Here, a veteran sailor and a deckhand are simply two sources of heat, equally reliant on one another. This practice requires a precise discipline. You must remain still to keep the layers of clothing and blankets from shifting, yet you must also adjust periodically to ensure that the moisture from your breath does not condense and freeze against your neighbour. It is a delicate balance of physical closeness and ventilation. For those watching from a distance, it might appear merely as a group of men resting, but for the sailors, it is an intense coordinated effort to maintain the heat balance of the entire unit. They have learned that the cold is an aggressive predator that exploits any gap in the line. By becoming a single, cohesive unit, they effectively deny the frost its foothold. If you have ever felt the biting chill of a winter night and appreciated the simple comfort of warmth, consider how essential that connection is to our survival, both in history and today. If this look in the lives of medieval sailors resonates with you, please hit the like button, subscribe for more in-depth historical explorations, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly value the community of curious minds that gathers here to piece together the rhythms of the past. Survival in a freezing maritime environment is as much about chemistry as it is about physical shelter. The human body is a furnace, and in the relentless cold of a North Sea voyage, that furnace requires constant, high-density fuel. The medieval pirate diet, often criticized for its monotony, was in fact a calculated survival strategy designed to combat the rapid depletion of metabolic heat. The rations were heavy on salted fats, dried legumes, and thick caloric stews. While it is easy to view a bowl of shipboard, lobscouse, or simple hardtack as meagre, these foods were chosen specifically for their ability to provide sustained energy. Fats, in particular, are the most energy-dense nutrients available, and they are essential for thermogenesis, the process by which the body generates internal heat to maintain its core temperature. When a sailor consumes a high-fat meal, the metabolic process of digestion itself produces a notable amount of heat. This is why you will see the crew prioritizing the consumption of salted pork or beef, even when the meat is tough or unappealing. The salt is a secondary, yet critical, element. It helps the body retain water, which is essential too. Prevent dehydration in an environment where the air is often dry and the physical output is intense. Dehydration makes the body far more susceptible to cold, as it reduces blood volume and hampers circulation, make it harder for the heart to pump warm blood to the extremities. By staying properly hydrated and well nourished, the sailors are effectively maintaining the pressure in their own internal heating system. The preparation of these meals is a feat of engineering in its own right. The galley, or the cooking space, is often the only location on the ship with a consistent heat source. In rough seas, managing a fire in a brick-lined hearth on a shifting wooden deck is dangerous work. The cooks, often the most respected men on board, must balance the ship's erratic motion with the need to keep the fire contained. The warmth radiating from the galley becomes a sanctuary. Sailors will linger there as long as possible, using the ambient heat to dry out gloves or warm their hands before returning to the biting air of the decks. There is also a reliance on fermented drinks such as small beer or cider, which provided a safe, albeit modest, source of calories and morale. While they are not the warming spirits of legend, they provide a necessary caloric boost during the long, dark watches. Every bite and every sip is calculated to stave off the lethargy that the cold induces. They do not eat for pleasure. They eat to keep the machinery of their bodies running. The diet is a direct reflection of the environment, harsh, heavy, and undeniably practical. As the ship groans and the temperature dips further, the importance of these daily rations becomes clear. The galley is not just a kitchen. It is the engine room of the vessel, the place where the crew gathers the energy required to fight the elements for another day. It is a humble, gritty process, but it is one that sustains the life of the ship when all other resources seem to be freezing away. When the bell tolls for the night watch, the ship enters its most vulnerable state. The transition from the shared warmth of the lower deck to the exposed, freezing darkness of the deck is a physical trauma that every sailor must prepare for with clinical precision. There is no such thing as a quick change of duty. The process begins long before the watch begins. A sailor on the upcoming shift must wake up, navigate the labyrinthine, ice-slicked companionway, and reach the deck while maintaining their internal body temperature. They do not move quickly, as rapid, erratic movement can lead to sweat, and sweat is the enemy. In the freezing night, any moisture trapped against the skin will cool rapidly, creating a conductive path that leaches heat directly from the body. The strategy for the night watch is one of extreme stillness interrupted by bursts of necessary activity. Once on deck, the priority is to identify the pockets of protection. Experienced sailors rarely stand in the center of the open deck. Instead, they position themselves behind the bulwarks or near the base of the mast, where the wind is deflected. Standing in the path of the wind is a rookie mistake. The wind chill factor on the open sea can drop the effective temperature well below the freezing point of seawater. They move in short, deliberate patterns, checking the rigging or scanning the horizon, then immediately return to their sheltered position to conserve heat. It is a dance of energy preservation. The salt spray is the primary adversary during these hours. As it hits the rigging and the wood, it leaves behind a film that freezes upon contact, creating a glaze of ice that makes every surface treacherous. The watchman must constantly check the deck for build-up, as ice creates a slip hazard that could be fatal in the dark, tossing sea. They use specialized wooden scrapers to clear the most vital walkways, ensuring that if they need to move quickly, they won't stumble. This is not for cleanliness. It's a tactical necessity to ensure mobility. The rhythm of the night is dictated by the sound of the wind through the ropes and the creaking of the ship. By listening to the pitch of the wind, the sailors can sense changes in the weather before they become visible, allowing them to adjust their positions or tighten their clothing before the intensity of the cold increases. Communication during the night watch is sparse and hushed. The cold air carries sound, but it also saps the desire to speak. Men rely on hand signals and established routines, minimizing the need to open their mouths and expose their lungs to the biting air. If one man begins to show signs of excessive shivering or slurred speech, indicators of the early stages of cold stress, his partner will immediately maneuver him back to the hatch to descend, replacing him on the line. It is an unspoken, high-stakes relay. They manage the ship not as a group of individuals, but as a single rotating organism that must survive the night as a whole. Every gear check, every step, and every moment of vigilant scanning is a calculated strike against the encroaching frost, ensuring that when the dawn finally breaks, the ship and its crew remain intact. The most relentless adversary on the open sea is not the wind, nor the dark, but the moisture that infiltrates every corner of the ship. Dampness is a persistent, structural reality that the crew must manage with unwavering discipline. Because the hull is timber and the environment is a spray-filled atmosphere, absolute dryness is a luxury that never exists. Instead, the focus shifts to moisture mitigation. This begins with the clothing itself. As mentioned, the sailors rely on wool, but even wool has a limit. When a coat becomes sodden from hours of freezing spray, it loses its loft, the tiny air pockets that provide insulation. To prevent this, the men employ a technique of staggered drying. During their off-duty hours, they don't just collapse into sleep, they assess their gear. If they have a spare tunic or pair of wool hose, they keep it wrapped in a dry canvas bundle, tucked high in a protected nook near the heat of the galley stove or buried deep within their bedding. They understand that if they go to sleep in wet clothes, they will never achieve deep rest. The evaporation of that water during the night will extract massive amounts of heat from their bodies, leading to exhaustion by morning. Therefore, the ritual of changing the driest possible layer before sleep is non-negotiable. It is a moment of cold, shivering vulnerability, but it is necessary to stop the cycle of damp-induced cooling. Beyond their personal clothing, they must manage the ship interior. Ventilation is a constant tension. If you close all hatches to keep the wind out, the humidity from the crew's breath and the damp bilges builds up, leading to condensation dripping from the deck beams above. If you keep them open, the freeze air rushes in. The seasoned sailor knows how to adjust the hatch covers to create just enough airflow to carry away the humid, stagnant air without flooding the quarters with freezing gusts. It is a constant game of air pressure management. They also use small improvised tools to clear puddles from the lower deck, using wooden scoops or absorbent scraps of scrap canvas to keep the sleeping platforms from becoming sodden. This is the hidden labour of survival. It doesn't look like heroic work, but it is the difference between health and decay. They also monitor each other's gear. If a shipmate is too exhausted to properly stow his wet wool, another will step in to wring it out and hang it near the galley vents. This is a survival community in the truest sense, where the dryness of your neighbour's gear is just as important as your own. Every sailor is a guardian of the collective climate. If you find these insights into the gritty, practical realities of medieval survival fascinating, please hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives in the hidden rhythms of history, and drop a comment below letting us know which part of their daily struggle you found most surprising. Your engagement helps us continue to reconstruct these lost chapters of the human experience. In the harsh, freezing environment of a medieval ship, health is the most fragile commodity. When the body is under constant thermal stress, the immune system is pushed to its absolute limits, and minor ailments can quickly escalate into systemic threats. The maintenance of life, therefore, becomes a rigid daily routine that focuses on hygiene and physical integrity. It is not about cleanliness for the sake of appearance, but cleanliness as a defensive measure. The primary goal is the prevention of sores, skin infections, and the debilitament of trench foot-style conditions caused by prolonged exposure to cold, salt-laden moisture. The skin, when constantly damp and coated in salt, begins to break down. To combat this, sailors perform a rigorous daily inspection of their hands and feet. They look for cracks, inflammation, or any sign of compromised skin integrity. If a crack appears, it is treated with whatever fats or oils are available, often a small portion of rendered animal fat saved from the galley. This creates a crude but effective barrier against the salt air and the biting cold. It prevents the skin from drying out to the point of splitting, which is a critical necessity when working with heavy, abrasive ropes that would otherwise tear unprotected skin. Hygiene also extends to the management of sweat. While it seems counterintuitive to worry about sweat in the freezing cold, physical labor causes the body to heat up rapidly. If a sailor is overlayered and begins to sweat during a strenuous shift at the rigging, that moisture will eventually cool and turn against them. Experienced sailors learn to self-regulate. They adjust their layers frequently, stripping off a heavy outer coat during intense work and donning it immediately afterward to prevent a sudden thermal collapse. Keeping the body free of accumulated salt and grime is also essential, as the salt acts as an irritant that keeps the skin in a state of perpetual, low-level inflammation. Whenever they have access to a bucket of relatively clean seawater, they use it to rinse their hands and faces, ensuring that the salt crust does not build up. The psychological aspect of this maintenance is equally significant. Keeping wonders clean and accounted for is a way of retaining a sense of identity and control in a world that feels increasingly indifferent to their survival. It is a quiet, meditative process. During the calm moments, you will see a sailor meticulously mending a tear in his wool tunic or scrubbing a patch of grime off his leather boots. This is not just tool repair, it is the maintenance of the self. By caring for the tools of their existence, their clothes, their boots, and their own skin, the crew members reinforce their commitment to remaining functional. They know that to fall behind on these small, repeated tasks is to surrender to the environment. Every repaired stitch and every application of tallow is a declaration that they intend to endure another day of the voyage. This discipline is the bedrock of their collective resilience. It is the reason they are able to function in conditions that would break those who do not understand the necessity of this daily maintenance. The cycle of survival on a medieval ship does not end with the breaking of dawn. In fact, the morning light marks the most critical transition in the daily routine. As the sun rises a pale watery disk struggling to pierce the thick freezing fog, the crew must shift from the stagnant energy, conserving mode of the night watch to the high output demands of the day. The transition begins with a communal movement. The cramped sleeping quarters, which were a singular block of shared warmth throughout the night, must now be broken down. This is not a time for lounging. The order of the day is immediate action to restore circulation. Sailors perform a series of brisk, deliberate movements, stretching, rubbing their arms, and pacing the small floor space to kickstart their metabolisms and shed the nocturnal lethargy. Breakfast is the first order of business, and it is a strategic event. They consume whatever high-calorie stores remain from the night before, often warm, fat-laden gruel or cold, hard rations that have been kept near the ship's internal heat sources. This is not merely for hunger, it is to load the body with the fuel required for the hours of labour ahead. As they step back on the main deck, the cold hits them with renewed intensity, but their bodies, now stoked with food and the residual heat of the night, are better equipped to handle the initial shock. They check their gear one final time, inspecting the salt, crusted ropes and ensuring their layers are secure. This morning check is a silent, professional assessment. They look at each other, gauging who is showing signs of fatigue and who is ready for the day's heavy lifting. The rhythm of the day is dictated by the ship's needs, constant adjustments to the sails, maintenance of the wooden deck, and the unending watch for land or hazards. Throughout these tasks, they sail in a steady, measured pace. They have learned that rushing leads to wasted energy and excessive sweating, both of which are luxuries they cannot afford. Instead, they work with a synchronized, efficient flow, moving in pairs or small groups to tackle the heavy lines. It is a grueling, repetitive existence, but it is one defined by the mastery of their environment. By the time the afternoon shadows begin to lengthen, they are already looking ahead to the next cycle. They monitor the colour of the sky and the movement of the swells, anticipating the temperature drop that the night will inevitably bring. This routine is the height of the medieval maritime life. It is not an existence of great adventures in the way stories often depict, but one of profound, quiet endurance. The real victory is not in the destination, but in the fact that they arrive there intact, having successfully outmaneuvered the cold through preparation, discipline, and communal reliance. As the day turns to dusk, they retreat back in the geometry of the ship, resetting their positions, checking their blankets, and binning the process all over again. It is a life that demands everything, yet offers only the promise of another dawn. If you have been captivated by this deep dive into the resilient spirit of medieval sailors, hit the like button, subscribe for more historic explorations, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history to life. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. In the brutal climate of the North Sea, the ship's rigging is not merely a collection of ropes and pulleys. It is a complex organism that becomes increasingly hostile with every degree the temperature drops. As the ice spray from the cresting waves lashes against the mast and stays, it undergoes a phase change, coating the hempen ropes in a slick, rigid layer of salt ice. This is a critical danger for the medieval mariner. A rope that is meant to be flexible, able to coil, tighten and release, suddenly becomes a frozen iron bar. If a sudden squall hits, the crew must adjust the sails instantly, but they are met with rigging that resists every attempt to manipulate it. The ice increases the weight of the mast and the upper yard significantly, shifting the ship's centre of gravity and making the vessel sluggish and unstable in rough swells. The task of clearing the ice from the rigging is one of the most perilous duties on board. A sailor must ascend the freezing wind, whipped heights of the shrouds, where the wind chill factor is exponentially higher than on the deck. They carry wooden mallets, never iron, which would damage the frozen wood or potentially spark, to gently tap the ice off the lines. It is a slow, methodical process. If they strike too hard, they risk snapping the brittle, frozen hemp. If they don't strike hard enough, the ice remains. The sailors' hands, encased in thick, wool-lined leather mittens, struggle to maintain a grip on the ice over ratlines. Their breath freezes in the air, creating a blinding mist around their faces, while the ship's erratic, rolling motion makes every upward movement a test of balance. The psychological pressure during this task is immense. One false step on a slippery iced over rope could mean a fall to the deck, or worse, into the freezing, dark abyss of the sea. Below, the rest of the crew watches intently, ready to adjust the tension of the lines the moment the ice break away, allowing the sail to finally fly free. This is not heroics. It is sheer necessity. The ice must go, or the ship will lose its ability to maneuver, leaving them at the mercy of the waves. As they work, the sailors communicate through hand signals and sharp, shouted commands that are barely audible over the howl of the wind. They are aware that the ice is a living thing. As long as the spray continues to hit the rigging, the glaze will return almost as soon as it is removed. It is an endless cycle of maintenance in the face of a freezing, expanding enemy. This struggle demonstrates the stark reality of maritime life. There is no machine to clear the ice, no heater to melt the frost. It is only the human hand, the wooden tool, and the raw resolve of the sailor against the cold, unyielding weight of the winter sea. Every rope's a small victory, a moment where the crew reclaims control over the vessel, ensuring they can catch the wind and steer away from the dangers of a lee shore. The lower deck is where the reality of maritime survival becomes most suffocating. As the temperature outside plunges, the instinct for every sailor is to seal the hatches and ports as tight as possible to create a pocket of warmth. However, this creates a secondary, equally dangerous problem: the rapid degradation of air quality. With dozens of men packed into small timber, walled space, the atmosphere quick becomes thick with carbon dioxide. The lingering scent of damp wool and the faint sour odour of bilge water and stale food. In the medieval era, ventilation was primitive, a simple hatch or a small, shielded opening near the bow. When these are kept closed to prevent the entry of freezing spray and sub-zero air, the air inside comes static and humid. This humidity is the true silent adversary. Every breath exhaled by the crew carries moisture, which condenses instantly on the cold inner hull and the overhead deck beams. Over the course of a long winter night, this condensation can accumulate into constant, slow drip that wets the bedding and the sailors' clothes. It creates a damp, cloying environment that feels much colder than the actual air temperature suggests. This moisture, combined with the lack of circulation, provides the perfect breeding ground for mould and mildew, which can settle into the seams of the ship and the fibres of the bedding. The crew knows that to survive, they must balance two extremes: the freezing, life-threatening air from outside and the suffocating moisture-laden air from inside. To manage this, the ship's officers, or those with the most experience, practice active venting. Even in the worst storms, they will crack a hatch on the leeward side, just enough to allow a slow exchange of air. This is a delicate, calculated move. Open it too wide, and the cabin temperature plummets, causing the sleeping men to wake shivering and unable to return to rest. Open it too little, and the air becomes so heavy and foul that it induces lethargy and respiratory distress. There is a tangible change in the atmosphere when the vent is correctly adjusted. The air stops feeling heavy and stagnant, and the condensation on the overhead beams begins to recede. It requires constant monitoring. As the wind shifts or the ship's angle changes, The vent must be adjusted to keep the internal microclimate stable. The sailors themselves contribute to this air management through their discipline. They know that keeping their sleeping areas as dry as possible is a collective duty. They avoid bringing excess moisture below, shaking off their outer layers and wringing out soaking wet gear before entering the quarters. When they are awake and crowd into the hold, they keep their movements deliberate, avoiding the unnecessary heavy breathing that comes from rushing or panic. It is a shared, low-level tension, this constant battle against the air they breathe. They are not just living on the ship, they are curating the air within it. This struggle is invisible to the outside world, yet for those trapped below in the dark, it is the primary focus of their existence. The quality of the air is the barometer of their survival. It tells them whether they are successfully isolating the cold or merely drowning in their own exhaled moisture. It is a gritty, unglamorous reality of the deep-sea voyage where the most essential element, the air itself, becomes something that must be fought for, maintained, and carefully guarded against the freezing void outside. When the cold becomes a constant companion, the human body begins to signal its distress in ways that are impossible to ignore. On a medieval ship, a simple cough is never just a cough, it is the beginning of a potential crisis. The damp, frigid air acts as a constant irritant to the lungs, and when paired with the cramped, poorly ventilated conditions of the lower deck, the environment becomes a breeding ground for respiratory ailments. The crew is well aware that a single illness can spread through the hold with terrifying speed, as there is no true isolation for the sick. They must rely on traditional, rudimentary remedies and the sheer endurance of the group to manage the spread of sickness. The first line of defense is the communal knowledge of basic, herbal, or folk medicine. There are no physicians on board, so the responsibility falls to the oldest or most experienced sailors, who act as the repositories of lore. They utilize whatever stores they have managed to keep, dried herbs, bitter roots, or infusions of vinegar and water, which are believed to help clear the lungs. These remedies are not cures in the modern sense, but they serve as a psychological and physical bridge, helping the sick to endure the symptoms until the body can fight off the affliction. The sailors understand that keeping the sick warm is the most critical intervention. A shipmate suffering from a fever or a deep chest cough is moved to the warmest spot on the ship, often near the bulkhead that borders the galley hearth. Physical symptoms like stiff, aching joints are universal among the crew due to the relentless exposure to moisture and cold. This is managed through a combination of massage, a surprisingly common practice among sailors, to keep the blood flowing, and the application of warmth. They use heated stones or heavy canvas bags filled with warm, dry grain, if available, to soothe the deep gnawing pain in the knees and shoulders. It is a laborious process that requires another man to give up his precious time to assist, but it is an ingrained part of the ship's culture. They understand that every man's health is linked. A weak crew member is a liability during a storm, and a sick man who can contribute to the workload adds immense pressure on his companions. The psychological impact of sickness in the cold is arguably more severe than the physical symptoms. The isolation of the sea, combined with the feeling of helplessness when the body begins to fail, can lead to a quick decline in morale. The crew combats this with a quiet, steady presence. They ensure the sick man is fed, that his bedding is kept as dry as possible, and that he is never left in total darkness. There is a sense of mutual protection that governs these moments. By caring for the sick, they are reaffirming the social contract of the ship, that no one is left to freeze alone. The endurance of the illness is seen as a battle against the environment, and surviving it is viewed as a triumph over the sea itself. It is a grueling, uncomfortable experience, stripped of all dignity, where the focus is entirely on basic human maintenance. This is the reality of marriage revival, where health is treated as a finite resource that must be guarded, defended, and restored through constant, diligent, and often primitive means. The feet are the most vital components of a sailor's survival kit. On a medieval ship, the deck is perpetually slick, covered in a mixture of brine, sleet, and freezing runoff. Standard issue footwear, typically simple leather turn shoes or ankle, high boots, were never intended for these conditions. When leather becomes saturated with salt water, it loses its protective properties and acts more like a conduit for the cold. As the water within the leather freezes, the boot becomes a rigid, abrasive cage that restricts blood flow, and it is here that the threat of frostbite moves from a risk to an imminent reality. The sailors know that if the feet are compromised, the ability to work, climb, or even stand steadily on a pitching deck is lost. To combat this, the crew employs a system of internal insulation that is as ingenious as it is crude. Since they have no access to thick modern wool socks, they rely on layers of scrap fabric, dried marsh grass, or even wads of raw, unspun wool, which they pack tightly around their feet inside their boots. This padding serves a dual purpose. It creates a buffer of dead air space for warmth and absorbs the moisture that would otherwise accumulate directly against the skin. They must change these insulation layers daily, drying them out near the galley or inside their tunics, as saturated padding is worse than no padding at all. This ritual of unpacking, drying and repacking the feet is one of the most important aspects of the morning routine. If a sailor feels the telltale tingling or numbness that signals the onset of frostbite, they must act immediately. There is no waiting for the shift to end. They will sit on the deck, pull off the boot, and use the friction of their own hands to massage the circulation back into the skin. It is a painful, slow process, but it is necessary to prevent the tissue from freezing solid. They work in pairs, often trading shifts on the ropes so that one man can focus on thawing while the other maintains the watch. The fear of frostbite is not just about the pain, it is about the long-term consequences. In a pre-antibiotic world, an untreated foot wound or a case of gangrenous tissue could mean the loss of a limb or death from infection. The boots themselves are treated with constant maintenance. When the ship is calm, sailors spend hours rubbing animal tallow or fish oil into the leather, attempting to create a water-resistant seal. It never works perfectly, and the leather eventually becomes stiff and cracked, but it is a necessary effort. Every crack in the leather is a door for the cold to enter, and every sailor knows that a well-oiled boot is a defensive line. This is the unglamorous, grueling work of maritime survival. It is not about grand gestures or heroic exploits. It is about the daily, disciplined task of keeping one's feet functional in an environment that is actively trying to freeze them. The sailor's boots are the foundation of his existence. They are the interface between his body and the unforgiving, freeing surface of the ship, and their maintenance is a matter of absolute, uncompromising necessity. Survival in a sub-zero maritime environment is a continuous race against metabolic collapse. Every hour spent work on deck or shivering in the hold burns through the body's energy reserves at a rate far higher than it would on land. There are days, especially during prolonged storms, when the galley fire cannot be maintained and the supply of fresh cooked rations is interrupted. It is in these moments of the caloric deficit that the true resilience of the crew is tested. The sailors are intimately aware of their body's state. They know that once they have exhausted their readily available blood sugar, the body begins to break down fat stores, a process that requires effort and generate heat, but eventually leaves them feeling hollow and lethargic. During these lean periods, the crew relies on their emergency rations, items that provide the maximum possible energy for the minimum amount of volume. This typically consists of hardtack, a dense flour, and water biscuit that is nearly indestructible, or dried salted protein. These are not meant to be enjoyed. They are fuel in its most basic, literal form. To eat hardtack in the cold, it must be soaked in water or crushed, which is a slow and difficult process. But the act of chewing and digesting this dense mass provides a steady release of energy that helps the body maintain its internal core temperature. The challenge is that without the thermal reward of a hot meal, the body doesn't receive that sudden, comforting spike in temperature that keeps the spirits high. The symptoms of a significant caloric deficit are unmistakable. The fine motor skills begin to degrade, speech becomes slower, and the ability to make quick, rational decisions on deck is compromised. The crew notices this in each other. They become quieter, moving with less urgency and struggling to keep their eyes focused on the task. The veteran sailors, who have seen this cycle before, become the disciplinarians of the diet. They force their shipmates to take small, frequent bites rather than eating a large amount all at once, which helps maintain a more stable blood sugar level. They also encourage them to drink small amounts of water, as dehydration exacerbates the feeling of exhaustion and makes it even harder for the body to circulate warmth. This is a stark, stripped-down reality of life on the ship. It is not about hunger in the sense of a temporary craving. It is about the body's machinery beginning to starve. They treat it with the same clinical attention they apply to the rigging or the ship seams. If they don't solve the deficit, they lose their strength, and if they lose their strength, they can't survive the next shift. They operate in a state of constant, low-level hunger that is simply a part of the maritime landscape. They have learned to thrive on the bare minimum, hoarding every calorie like a precious resource. When the weather finally clears and the galley fire is relit, the first bowl of hot, fat, rich stew is not just a meal. It is a critical restoration of the crew's integrity. It is the moment the deficit is closed, the machinery is refueled, and the ship's collective health is pulled back from the brink for another few days of the voyage. The handover of the watch is the most critical juncture of the ship daily operation, a moment where the physical state of the crew and the safety of the vessel meet. It is never a casual affair. When the bell sounds, the men who have been enduring the exposure on deck must descend, while those who have been resting must prepare to emerge. This transition is governed by a strict, almost ritualistic discipline, designed to prevent the catastrophic loss of heat that occurs during the exchange. The incoming watch does not simply rush on the deck. They take time to secure every button, tighten every scarf, and ensure their hands are properly encased before stepping into the freezing air. As the two groups cross paths near the hatches, a silent, efficient communication takes place. The outgoing sailors provide a crucial assessment of the current conditions, the state of the rigging, the predictability of the swells, and the location of ice buildup on the deck. This is not just information, it is a tactical briefing. If the wind has shifted, or if a particular section of the deck has become dangerous due to freezing spray, this knowledge is passed on instantly. There is a palpable sense of relief in the algae crew as they descend, but it is tempered by the knowledge that their shipmates are stepping in the very environment they are fleeing. They often offer a firm nod or a brief touch on the shoulder, a non-verbal acknowledgement of the shared burden. The incoming crew, meanwhile, uses this moment to mentally adjust. They transition from the warmth of the lower deck to the bracing reality of the winter night, intentionally slowing their breathing to avoid the shock of the cold air. They do not speak unnecessarily, as keeping the mouth closed and the chest protected from the initial blast of wind is vital. They observe the outgoing men, looking for signs of severe cold stress, slurred speech or uncoordinated movement, and if they see them, they immediately assist them in getting below or securing their gear. This is the moment where the ship's collective intelligence is renewed, the weary are relieved, and the alert take their place at the helm and the lines. These rituals are the glue that holds the crew together. They are grounded in the realization that the shift is a dangerous, exhausting marathon that no single man can run alone. By formalizing the handover, they reduce the margin for error and ensure that every sailor who steps on the deck is as prepared as possible. It is a humble, quiet display of professionalism, stripped of all artifice. They are not performing for an audience. They are operating with the efficiency of a well-maintained engine. When the last man of the incoming watch takes his position, and the last man of the outgoing watch slips below, the rhythm of the ship continues unbroken. This cyclical handover is the height of the voyage, the process by which they maintain constant vigilance without burning out the individuals who make it possible. It is the tactile backbone of their survival, ensuring that, regardless of the temperature or the ferocity of the wind, there is always a capable, alert hand to steer the ship through the long, dark hours. On a ship navigating freezing waters, the most valuable equipment is not found in the captain's quarters or the ship's log. It is found on the main deck, held in the calloused hands of a deckhand. The tools of survival in these conditions are stark, heavy, and undeniably manual. The most critical of these is the wooden ice scraper, a simple stout piece of oak or ash fashioned into wedge-shaped blade. Iron tools are avoided whenever possible, as metal conducts cold rapidly and can become a hazard to both the wood of the deck and the hands of the sailor. When the sea spray freezes into a thick crystalline glaze, the deck becomes a death trap. A ship laden with ice is not only slippery, but top-heavy, the weight of the ice accumulation high above. The waterline can significantly reduce the vessel's stability, making it prone to dangerous rolling. The sailors use these wooden scrapers to systematically chip away at the ice crust. It is a rhythmic, laborious task that requires precise body positioning. You can't simply chop, you must work the edge of the tool under the ice layer and pry it off in chunks, being careful not to gouge the planks beneath. If the deck is damaged, it will hold more water, which will then freeze and expand, eventually rotting the timber from the inside. The scrapers are kept tethered to the sailor's belt. In the freezing dark, losing a tool is often equivalent to losing a limb. They work in tandem, one man scraping, while the other sweeps the dislodged chunks overboard, ensuring the path remains clear for anyone who might need to move quickly in emergency. Beyond the scrapers, the sailors rely on heavy-duty wooden mallets for the rigging. These are used to strike the ropes, vibrating the hempen fibers and causing the frozen salt, ice to shatter and flake off. The mallet must be dense enough to generate force, but light enough to be swung repeatedly in the wind. This is a skill that takes years to master. Swing too hard and you fray the critical rigging lines, weakening the ship's ability to handle the wind. Swing too softly and the ice remains. It is a delicate, calibrated dance of force and restraint. These tools are the only things standing between the crew and a ship that is effectively frozen in place, paralysed by the weight of its own environment. When the weather is particularly fierce, they use improvised leverage bars, thick, tapered wooden poles, to help tension the sails. When the ropes are frozen solid, they cannot be pulled by hand. The sailors must use these bars as levers, working together to coax the stubborn, ice-encrusted line into place. Every time a sailor reaches for one of these tools, it is a conscious decision to fight back against the creeping paralysis of the winter sea. These are not tools for construction, they are tools of preservation. They allow the crew to keep the ship's geometry consistent, its stability maintained, and its movement fluid, despite the efforts of the frost to lock everything down. In the history of maritime survival, these humble hand-hewn implements are as important as the rudder or the sails. They are the instruments of human will, used to carve a path through an environment that is otherwise entirely indifferent to the ship's survival. A wooden ship is a living, breathing structure, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the extreme conditions of a freezing northern voyage. Wood is a natural material that reacts directly to the environment. It expands with humidity and contracts when the temperature plummets. In the biting cold of the winter sea, the massive timbers of the hull, the deck planks and the masts undergo a process of thermal contraction. As the wood fibres tighten and the moisture when the grain freezes and expands, the structural integrity of the ship begins to shift. This is not a sudden failure, but a constant grinding pressure that manifests as rhythmic creaks, groans, and sometimes the terrifying sound of a plank snapping under the tension. The most immediate danger of this contraction is the opening of the ship seams. The oakum, a mixture of tarred rope fibres used to seal the gaps between planks, can become brittle in the cold. As the wood shrinks, these seams pull apart, creating narrow fissures through which frigid seawater begins to seep. This is the weeping of the ship. The crew is acutely aware of the sound of water trickling into the hold. It is a noise that triggers an immediate, visceral reaction. They must spend hours in the dark, cramped space of the lower interior, using lamps to track these leaks and stuffing them with fresh, hot tar, soaked oakum. It is a never-ending game of cat and mouse. As soon as one seam is sealed, the ship shifts again and another begins to weep. Maintenance is particularly brutal because it must be done from both inside and, when the sea is calm enough, outside. A sailor dangling over the side of the hull in a harness, clinging to a freezing slicked exterior while attempting to jam oakum into a seam, is at the mercy of every wave. They must work with rhythmic, precise movements, hammering the caulking iron against the hull in synchronization with the rise and fall of the ship. If they misjudge the motion, the sea will reclaim the tools or, worse, drag them against the abrasive wood. It is a testament to their dedication that the ship remains watertight at all. They are constantly rebuilding the integrity of the hull, while the environment is trying to tear it apart. The masts too suffer from this contraction. They are tall, vertical levers, and as they contract, the tension on the rigging lines changes, often loosening them to the point where the mast begins to sway dangerously in the wind. The crew must constantly monitor these shifts, adjusting the lanyards and didays to compensate for the changing geometry of the ship's skeleton. It is a hidden, structural war, a fight against the laws of physics that govern the materials of the vessel. The ship does not just sail through the cold, it survives it by being constantly retuned, repaired and reinforced. Every creak in the night is a report from the ship itself, and the seasoned sailor learns to interpret these sounds, knowing exactly when a groan is just the timber adjusting to the chill, and when it is the warning of a structural failure that requires immediate, decisive action. The physical challenges of a winter voyage are grueling, but they are eventually eclipsed by the most insidious enemy of all, the psychological fog. After weeks of staring at horizons that remain stubbornly, relentlessly grey, where the sky bleeds into the sea in a seamless, featureless curtain, the human mind begins to fray. The sensory deprivation is profound. There are no colours, no landmarks, and no variations in the environment. The world has shrunk to the width of the deck and the length of the shift. This lack of visual and sensory stimulation causes a peculiar form of mental lethargy. The brain, lacking new inputs, begins to slow its processing. Decisions that should be instantaneous become sluggish, and the sharp edge of situational awareness starts to dull. This mental fatigue is not a sign of weakness, but a biological response to an environment that offers no reward for alertness. The crew experiences this as a creeping sense of detachment. Conversations in the hold become sparse, not just because of the cold, but because there is nothing new to discuss. The same faces, the same repetitive task, and the same biting wind create a loop of existence that feels infinite. They describe it as a heaviness that settles in the chest, a feeling that the void has always been happening and will never end. This state is dangerous because it leads to complacency. A man who is mentally fogged is a man who misses the subtle change in the wind that signals a gale, or forgets to properly secure a line, leading to an accident. To combat this, the crew relies on the rigid structure of their routine. They cling to the schedule of the bells, the rotation of the watches, and the specific repetitive nature of their daily maintenance tasks. This structure provides a framework that holds their minds together when everything else feels fluid and indistinct. The act of sharpening a knife, mending a sail, or checking the bilge levels becomes a meditative anchor. By focusing intently on the smallest, most concrete details, they prevent their minds from drifting into the abyss of the grey horizon. They also look for small breaks in the monotony, a shared piece of news, a brief humorous anecdote about life on shore, or even the sighting of a stray piece of debris or a seabird. These are not just distractions, they are vital interruptions that pierce the psychological fog. They also monitor each other. A sailor who goes quiet, who stares too long at the churning wake, or who misses a rhythm in the work is gently steered back by his comrades. They know that isolation in this state is the fastest path to despair. By keeping the community tight, by forcing interaction, and by maintaining the shared burden of the labour, they prevent the fog from taking hold of any one individual. It is a collective effort to remain present. They are fighting for their sanity just as they fight for their warmth. The realization that their minds are just as much a part of the ship, equipment as the sails or the rudder, is a cornerstone of their survival strategy. They know that if they lose their mental focus, the ship is as good as lost. They work to keep the internal light of awareness burning, even when the external world is a bleak, monochromatic void. After weeks of surviving with the grey, monochromatic void, the anticipation of land becomes the singular, driving force of the entire crew. In the final stretch of the voyage, the atmosphere on the ship shifts from one of grueling endurance to a state of heightened, almost nervous, vigilance. They no longer look for the patterns of the wind for survival alone. They look for them as messengers of the shore. The seasoned sailors, many of whom have spent a lifetime navigating these treacherous corridors, become human sensors, reading the subtlest changes in the environment that signal they are approaching the end of their isolation. The first sign is often the quality of the air itself. Even miles before land is sighted, the composition of the breeze changes. It loses the sharp, sterile bite of the open ocean and carries with it faint, earthy hints of distant coastlines, the smell of damp peat, pine, or even the subtle shift in pressure that occurs when wind moves over solid ground rather than a fluid surface. The crew observes the behavior of the birds with obsessive interest. When the gulls or terns change from nomadic oceanic wanderers to those that fly with a purposeful, directional flight, the mood on deck intensifies. They know these birds are commuting between nests and feeding grounds, and that their presence marks the outer boundary of the coastal ecosystem. As they move closer, the very behavior of the sea begins to change. The rhythm of the swells grows more erratic as they encounter the underwater topography, reefs, shoals, and hidden shelves that force the deep water rollers to break and churn. The sailors listen to the ship's movement, feeling the subtle drag that occurs as the water shallows. Every man is on edge, eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for that crucial hairline break in the sky that distinguishes a solid bank of fog from the distant, dark silhouette of land. This is the moment of maximum risk. The ship is heavy, the crew is exhausted from the long winter, and the margin for error in navigating unknown coastal waters is non-existent. When land is jagged line, emerging from the haze, the reaction is rarely an outburst of joy. It is a quiet, profound settling. The collective tension that has been held for weeks slowly begins to dissipate. They prepare for the arrival with the same disciplined, systematic approach they applied to every day of the voyage. They check the anchors, coil the ropes one last time, and clear the deck of the ice, scraping tools that have been their constant companions. The successful completion of this journey is not defined by the destination self, but by the fact that they have arrived intact. They have navigated the freeze abyss, managed the structural failures, and outlasted the winter, proving that their methodical, communal approach was enough to conquer the elements. As they prepare to drop anchor, the grueling routine of the open sea finally gives way, and for the first time in months, the crew allows them to believe in the return to dry land. If you have enjoyed this detailed exploration in the resilient hidden world of the medieval maritime life, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives in history, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement fuels our dedication to reconstructing these lost chapters of the human experience. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. Beneath the deck of a medieval merchant or exploration ship lies a world of deliberate, geometric precision. The hold is not merely a place to throw cargo, it is the structural anchor of the vessel. The crew understands that the ship's stability, its ability to right itself when pushed by a powerful wave, depends entirely on how that space is utilized. They operate negotiable logic. Heavy items, such as barrels of salted provisions, stone ballast or trade metals, must be placed as low as possible, centered along the keel. This keeps the ship's center of gravity deep, preventing it from becoming top-heavy, a fatal flaw that could cause the ship to capsize in a heavy sea. As the voyage progresses and provisions are consumed, the geometry of the hold changes. This requires the crew to constantly redistribute the remaining weight to maintain the ship's trim. If the cargo shifts, the ship develops a list, a permanent tilt, that makes sailing incredibly inefficient and dangerous. The sailors manage this by creating a tight interlocking matrix of barrels, crates and sacks, wedged into place with dunnage, small pieces of scrap wood or bundles of brushwood. These are not just loose items, they are jammed into every crevice, ensuring that even if the ship is tossed at a 4-5 degree angle, nothing will shift an inch. The sound of a heavy barrel breaking free in the middle of a storm is a terrifying prospect, as it can act like a battering ram, smashing through the hull from the inside. This task is deeply physical and often performed in near total darkness or by the flickering light of a single lantern. The sailors must be intimate familiar with every cubic foot of the hold. They move with an almost practiced, rhythmic grace, passing heavy loads through narrow hatchways, ensuring that the pressure is evenly distributed across the floorboards. Is a slow, methodical process that requires absolute concentration. There is no room for ego or shortcuts. If a man places a heavy crate too high or off-center, the entire crew will pay the price when the wind picks up and the ship struggles to respond to the helm. Moreover, the storage must account for the environment. Perishables like flour or salted meat are stored in the driest, most protected sections, surrounded by layers of dunnage to keep them off the cold, damp bottom boards where bilge water inevitably pools. They organize their space like a puzzle that must be solved every single day. This is the hidden work of the sailor, the constant, invisible management of weight and volume that keeps the ship afloat. It is a testament to their skill that they can maintain a balanced, stable vessel while navigating the chaos of the open ocean, turning the interior of the ship into a solid, unified mass that can withstand the immense, crushing power of the sea. On a ship where everything is made of timber, tar, and dry cordage, fire is a constant, terrifying paradox. It is both the greatest threat to the vessel and the only thing standing between the crew and total collapse. The galley, usually a simple hearthbox filled with sand and lined with fireproof stone, is the heart of the ship. Managing this fire in the middle of a freezing spray, drenched ocean is a high, stakes daily operation. The wood used for fuel must be kept bone dry, yet every piece of the ship is perpetually damp. Consequently, the galley crew spends as much time protecting their fuel supply as they do cooking. To keep the fire alive, they use protected fuel, branches and logs stored in the most sheltered parts of the hold, often wrapped in thick canvas or animal hides to ward off the salt-laden humidity. If the fuel gets wet, it produces dense, acrid smoke that fills the lower decks, causing respiratory distress and irritation, which is why the quality of the firewood is a matter of collective morale. When the weather turns severe and waves wash over the deck, the galley hearth becomes a battlefield. A single rogue wave hitting the cook fire can extinguish it instantly, and relighting it in a wet, cold ship is a grueling, time-consuming process that often involves using every bit of precious kindling they have managed to keep dry. The fire serves 3 critical functions. It provides a hot meal, which is the only way to warm the body's core during a winter watch. It acts as the primary source of light in the dark, suffocating hold, and it creates a dry zone where wet clothing can be hung to prevent the rot that comes from constant moisture. Because of this, the galley is the social nexus of the ship. The crew monitors the fire with an intensity that borders on religious. They treat the flames with respect, knowing that if the fire goes out, the warmth goes with it, and the morale of the entire crew will begin to plummet within hours. This management requires strict discipline. They never leave the fire unattended, even for a moment, and they maintain a reserve of embers covered in ash to ensure that if the main flame is doused, it can be revived quickly. This is the art of survival on the water, maintaining a controlled, captive blaze in an environment that is defined by its ability to extinguish heat. It is a daily, disciplined struggle against the damp, cold reality of the sea. When the fire is burning steadily, the galley provides a small flickering beacon of order, a reminder that even in the middle of the most hostile environment on Earth, the crew can command enough heat to sustain life, restore their strength, and push forward another day. In the absolute darkness of a winter night, with a gale howling through the rigging and the deck pitching beneath one's feet, vision becomes a secondary sense. A sailor cannot rely on what he sees to manage the sails. He must rely on what he can feel. This is why the language of knots is the most vital dialect on board. Every knot has a specific purpose, a specific tension capacity, and most importantly, a unique tactile signature. A sailor can distinguish between a bowline, a clove hitch, or a sheet bend simply by running his fingers over the rope. In the freezing cold, when hands are numb and mittens are stiff, this muscle memory is the only thing that ensures the lines are secured correctly. The rope's thems change in the cold. Hempen lines absorb moisture and swell, becoming heavy and rigid, while others freeze into stiff coils that resist bending. A sailor must know how to adjust his technique for these varying states. If a knot is tied too tight in the cold, it may become impossible to undo when the temperature shifts or the rope dries out. Conversely, if it is too loose, the vibration of the ship will cause it to shake free, leading to a catastrophic failure of the sail or rigging. The crew spends hours practicing these knots, not just for the sake of utility, but as a form of meditative training. They tie and untie them day after day until the movement is as unconscious as breathing. This knowledge is passed down like a sacred, practical inheritance. A senior sailor will watch a younger hand, checking not just the outcome of the knot, but the fluidity of the movement used to create it. He looks for wasted motion. In the middle of a storm, every second spent fiddling with a line is a second of exposure to the elements. They learn to tie knots that can be released even under immense strain, the quick release knots that allow them to drop a sail in an instant if a gust threat to capsize the vessel. This is the geometry of survival, articulated through cordage and friction. There is a deep unspoken bond formed through this shared language. When two men work together to handle a heavy line, they do not need to speak. One understands the tension the other is feeling through the vibration of the rope. They work in tandem, anticipating the movement of the ship, adjusting their grip, and tying off the lines with a synchronized rhythm that is almost musical. The ropes are the nervous system of the ship, and the knots are the synapses that keep it functioning. To a land dweller, a knot is just a tangle. To a sailor in the winter sea, it is a definitive, engineered solution to a life or death problem. It is the ability to command the rigging without needing a single flicker of light, ensuring that even in the deepest, most blind hour of the night, the ship remains under their absolute tactile control. On a ship isolated in the winter hierarchy, the captain's word as law is only the visible structure. Beneath it exists a more fluid, essential social order, the hierarchy of expertise. When the ship is battered by a storm, and the captain is exhausted or confined by the demands of navigation, the effective power shifts to those with the deepest maritime memory. These are the veteran sailors who have seen the worst the sea can offer, and have survived to tell of it. Their authority is not granted by rank, but by a proven record of calm under pressure. The crew instinctively turns to them for cues. If a veteran remains steady while the deck is awash, the others find the resolve to stay steady as well. This hierarchy is maintained through a mutual, quiet respect. The younger sailors, or green hands, are not treated with disdain. They are treated as apprentices to survival. The veterans guide them, not through commands, but through demonstration. They show them where to stand to avoid being swept overboard, how to gauge the weight of a wave before it strikes, and how to manage their energy during a long, grueling watch. This apprenticeship is vital because a crew member who does not understand the social flow of the ship is a hazard to everyone. The respect is earned through shared suffering. When a man performs his duty perfectly despite being frozen to the bone, he earns his place in the ship's collective trust. Conflict, when it arises, is managed with surgical precision. There is no time for petty disputes or long simmering resentment. The environment is too dangerous for such distractions. If two men clash, it is usually mediated quickly, often by the veterans who remind them that their anger is a luxury they can't afford. The ship's culture demands a forgetting of the self. Individual ego is subordinated to the needs of the vessel. This creates a remarkable sense of unity. In the cramped, dark, and often miserable conditions of the hold, the men move round each other with a choreographed consideration, sharing the limited warmth and space without being told. This social fabric is the ship's most robust piece of equipment. It is what keeps the crew from fracturing under the immense psychological pressure of the voyage. The hierarchy is essentially a system for distributed responsibility and mitigating panic. When a crisis hits, the crew knows exactly who is responsible for the helm, who is responsible for the rigging, and who is responsible for keeping the fire burning. There is no confusion, only the execution of duty. This shared responsibility transformed from a collection of individuals into a singular, functioning unit. It is this depth of mutual respect and reliance that allows the ship to survive the winter, a testament to the idea that on the open ocean, the strength of the collective is the only true defence against the indifference of the sea. For a seasoned sailor, a ship is not a silent object. It is a creature that speaks in a complex, shifting language of wood, rope, and tension. In the dead of night, when the visual world vanishes into a black void, the crew navigates almost entirely through their ears. Every groan of a timber, every snap of a line, and every hiss of foam against the hull carries a specific meaning. This soundscape is the primary diagnostic tool of the ship. A sailor can tell by the rhythm of the masts, creaking whether wind is merely gusting or if a sustained dangerous pressure is building behind the sails. This acoustic sensitivity is a form of survival. When a seam begins to weaken, it doesn't just look different, it sounds different. The wood sings a sharper, higher, pitched note under the stress of the sea. Sailors describe this as a warning cry from the ship itself. They learn to ignore the general, ambient cacophony of a sailing vessel, the constant clatter of loose gear and the hum of the rigging, to focus on the specific frequencies of strain. If a rigging line is beginning to fray, the sound changes from a taut, musical hum to a dull, erratic thrumming. The veteran crew member hears this change instantly, even over the roar of a storm, and knows exactly which line needs attention before it snaps. The ship also teaches the crew about the nature of the sea through sound. The way a wave hits the bow tells the sailor how deep the water is, and whether the vessel is cutting through a swell or slamming against a rising wall of water. A deep, hollow boom against the hull indicates that the ship is riding high and potentially vulnerable to rolling, while a crisp, sharp slap suggests a clean, efficient passage through the surf. They listen for the gurgle of the bilge water. Its volume and movement tell them how much water is accumulating in the lower reaches long before they need to lift the floorboards to verify it. This reliance on sound fosters a unique, quiet intensity among the crew. They rarely shout, as they know that unnecessary noise masks the subtle voices of the ship. They communicate in low, guttural tones or through hand signals, keeping the acoustic environment clear for listening. Is a shared, hyper-focused state where the entire crew acts as a collective ear for the vessel. This soundscape is their early warning system. It allows them to predict the ship's reactions and the ocean's intent. By learning to hear the ship, they bridge the gap between their own limitation and the vast, chaotic reality of the ocean, turning a massive, wooden machine into an extension of their own senses. It is a profound, immersive connection, a conversation between man and material that remains one of the most remarkable hidden aspects of the medieval maritime experience. When the hold is breached or the voyage extends far beyond the anticipated arrival date, the ship enters a state of caloric crisis. In this reality, the distribution of food is not just a logistical task, it is the most critical test of the ship's social integrity. The crew operates on a communal guarantee. There is a deep-seated understanding that if one man starves, the work of the ship suffers, and if the work suffers, everyone is at risk. Rations are no longer private possessions. They are accounted for, measured, and dispensed with a gravity that acknowledges their status as life, sustaining fuel. The veteran sailors often take charge of the starvation math. They calculate exact how many days of travel remain against the meagre stores left in the barrels. They might decide to cut the daily ration of hardtack in half, or forgo the salted meat entirely in favour of a watery, thin soup made from the remaining scraps of grain. This transitioned austerity is handled with a grim matter of fact discipline. There is no negotiation and no hoarding. The crew understands that any secret stash is a betrayal of the group. If a man is caught hiding food, the punishment is not just social ostracization. It is an acknowledgement that he has actively compromised the survival of his peers. This period of hunger changes the internal rhythm of the ship. Movement becomes slower, more deliberate, and notably quiet. The energy spent on talking or unnecessary activity is energy lost to the cold. They save their strength for the essential tasks, manning the helm, trimming the sails, and tending the bilge. During meal times, they gather in the dim light of the galley, each man receiving his precise, tiny portion. It is a moment of solemn equality. They eat slowly, chewing the dense, reconstituted biscuit with a focus that makes the act of consumption seem almost ritualistic. This shared struggle binds them in a way that plenty never could. When they are hungry, they are intimately aware of each other's physical state. They look for the signs of rapid weight loss or the glazed, hollow look in the eyes of their shipmates. They share the heavy tasks among those who still have the most strength, rotating the burden so that no single man collapses from the deficit. It is a radical, stripped-down form of human cooperation. In the face of a true shortage, the hierarchy of the ship melts into shared, desperate necessity. They realize that they are not just fighting the sea, they are fighting the clock. Sustained only by the ironclad commitment to ensure that if they are to fail, they will fail as a single, indivisible crew. In the freezing conditions of a winter sea, the ship's sails are its most vulnerable and essential organ. Exposure to the relentless cycle of salt spray, freezing winds, and the extreme tension of gales cause the heavy canvas or linen to become stiff, brittle, and eventually prone to tearing. When a sail rips, it is not merely a damaged piece of fabric, it is a structural failure that compromises the ship's ability to navigate. The repair of a sail or mending is a specialized grueling task that must often be performed while the ship is still underway, with the wind still tearing at the damaged edge. The tools of the trade are as primitive as they are effective: heavy, galvanized needles and thick, waxed hempen thread. The wax is essential. It prevents the thread from fraying and creates a water-resistant seal once the stitches are pulled tight. A sailor repairing a sail must have hands of iron. The canvas, soaked in salt and frozen hard, is like trying to sew through a board. They use a palm, a thick, reinforced leather strap worn over the palm of the hand, to drive the needles through the layers of fabric. It is a slow, rhythmic process where every puncture of the needle is calculated to ensure the repair is as strong as the original weave. Working on a torn sea is a high-stakes, acrobatic endeavour. When the sail is lowered to the deck, the sailors must wrestle with the massive, frozen expanse of heavy cloth. They must work as a team. One man holds the tension, another feeds the needle, and a third ensures the seam is aligned perfectly. They are oft exposed to the biting cold for hours, their fingers numb and their clothing saturated with spray. They do not work with haste, but with a terrifying absolute precision. A loose stitch in a storm will simply pull out, leading to a larger, more catastrophic tear that could strip the mast of its utility entirely. This work is a form of industrial archaeology. They are constantly reinforcing old repairs, patching over patches, and adding layers of secondary fabric to the most stressed sections. By the end of a long, cold voyage, the sails are heavy, scarred, and dense with years of accumulated work. Every seam tells a story of a gale survived or a structural weakness bolstered. The mending of the sail is the ultimate act of maintenance, a demonstration of the crew's refusal to accept defeat. They know that as long as they can keep the canvas catching the wind, they can keep the ship moving toward home. It is a quiet, brutal, and utterly necessary struggle, proving that on a medieval ship, survival is not about avoiding damage, it is about the relentless, skilled ability to repair it. The hours between midnight and dawn are often referred to by the crew as the hollow time, when the ship is holding a steady course and the wind is not yet demanding an immediate, frantic response. The night watch descends into a profound, heavy boredom. This is not the leisure of the shore, it is a weight of its own. Without the distraction of labour, the mind begins to wander, and the cold, which was manageable when the body was in motion, begins to seep through the layers of wool and leather. To combat this, the crew relies on the simple vital tradition of keeping the mind alive. In the dim, shadow-filled space of the deck, men will huddle in pairs or small groups. They share stories, often the same anecdote repeated until they become part of the ship's oral history. These are rarely grand tales of heroism. They are simple memories, the taste of a specific dish back home, the appearance of a particular harbour at sunset, or the quirks of a family member left behind. By speaking these memories aloud, they anchor them to the world beyond the frozen ocean. They use their voices to carve a small, warm space out of the vast, indifferent night. Sometimes they turn to games that require no equipment. They play mental riddles, recite counting rhymes, or engage in silent games, competitions of endurance. Like who can stay perfectly still the longest, or who can identify the most sounds in the rigging. These are not just time fillers, they are psychological exercise. They force the brain to remain active, prevent it from slipping in the dangerous, sluggish drift that leads to complacency. A man who is bored is a man who stops watching. A man who is engaged in a story or a game remains alert. His eyes constantly look back to sail, the compass, and the sea. This shared downtime is a vital part of the ship's social health. It allows the men to see each other as individuals with lives, families, and histories, rather than just cogs in the vessel's operation. It fosters a sense of empathy that is crucial for when the shift ends and the real work begins. When the bell eventually rings to end the watch, they rise together, the cold no longer feeling like a crushing weight but a familiar adversary. They have successfully survived the hollow time by filling it with the substance of their humanity. It is a quiet, overlooked form of endurance, the ability to maintain one's sanity in the face of absolute repetitive isolation, ensuring that when the light finally returns, they are still sharp, still connected, and still ready to sail. On a long-distance voyage through freezing waters, the concept of cleanliness is completely redefined. There is no such thing as a bath, and fresh water is too precious to waste on the skin. Yet the accumulation of filth, a mixture of salt, engine grease if applicable, coal dust, dried sweat, and the pungent, oily residue of the sea, is more than a matter of comfort. It is a biological hazard. These sea stains trap moisture against the skin, which can lead to severe chafing, the rapid spread of infections, and the dreaded trench foot or skin rot that plagues men who cannot dry off. The crew manages this through a rigid, pragmatic hygiene protocol. They utilize coarse brushes, often made from the stiff bristles of hog hair, to scrub the salt crusts from their outer woolen layers. They do not wash their clothes in the traditional sense. They beat them against the deck, or hang them in the freezing wind to air out the salts and oils. The wind is their primary cleaner, stripping away the moisture and the smell. For their skin, they rely on the sparse application of animal fats or tallow, which creates a protective water-resistant barrier that helps keep the brine from irritating the pores. When a sailor has a moment of respite near the galley, he might use a tiny amount of warm water to wipe his face and hands, but even this is done with the efficiency of a surgeon. They are acutely aware of the dampness factor. Any moisture on the body is an enemy. If a shirt comes soaked with spray, it is removed and hung in the driest, warmest corner of the hold, often near the ceiling where the heat from the galley lingers, until it is stiff and dry. They prefer the feeling of a hard salt, crusted garment to a damp one, as the salt crust acts as a secondary layer of insulation. This regime is not about vanity, it is about maintaining the body as a functioning tool. They monitor each other for sores or rashes, the hallmark signs of prolonged exposure to grime and damp. A small cut that would be insignificant on land becomes a rarity issue on the ship. They treat these with poultices of whatever is available, often just clean cloth and intense observation. It is a gritty, unglamorous aspect of life that is never shown in romanticized tales of the sea. It is the reality of men living in a state of suspended animation, where the human body is constantly fighting against the corrosive, invasive power of the environment. By accepting this state of managed filth, they prevent the breakdown of the skin and maintain the physical stamina required to keep the ship fighting against the winter. The transition from the ship to the shore is not the immediate relief one might imagine. After months of existing on a surface that is never still, the sensation of the first night on land is a profound, almost disorienting psychological and physical trauma. The ground is terrifyingly rigid. It does not heave, it does not groan, and it does not pitch. For a sailor who has spent weeks calibrating his inner ear to the constant motion of the ocean, the sudden stability of the earth feels like a heavy, immovable weight pressing up through the soles of his boots. The world feels wrong in its silence and its stillness. The first night is characterized by a strange form of insomnia. The sailor, now in a bed or on a floor that does not sway, finds his brain constantly waiting for the ship's rhythm, the subtle lift and fall that signals the vessel is alive and moving. With ambient, the silence is deafening. The ambient noise of the ocean, which had become a constant, comforting background hum, is replaced by the foreign, irregular sounds of the land, the rustle of trees, the distant bark of a dog, or the absolute crushing stillness of a room. Many sailors find they can't sleep in a bed at all for the first few nights, instead choosing to sleep on the floor, their bodies still seeking the phantom memory of the deck's tilt. Physically, the land eggs are a genuine condition. The muscles that have spent months adjusting to deck's instability are now confused. He may lurch or stumble, his brain overcompensating for a movement that is no longer there. He feels unnaturally heavy, as if gravity has suddenly doubled in strength. Even the act of walking across a room feels like elaborate, conscious performance. The body is in a state of mourning for the ship. It has become adapted to a life of fluid peril, and now it must painfully relearn how to exist in a world that stays put. This final night also marks the emotional conclusion of their trial. As the sailor lays in the dark, he realizes that the psychological fog is slowly lifting. He is no longer tethered to the minute-by-minute survival of the watch. There is a strange, bittersweet melancholy in this realization. He has survived, he is home, and the intense singular focus of his communal life on the ship is beginning to dissolve in the mundane complexities of life on shore. He looks back at the voyage not with longing, but with a quiet, hardened pride. He has come through the winter, he has seen the grey void, and he has returned with the knowledge that he is capable of enduring the unendurable. The ship is behind him, the sea is silent, and for the first time in months he is simply and profoundly at rest. This concludes our deep dive into the resilient world of the medieval maritime life. We have explored the tools, the structural struggles, the psychological toll, and the communal bonds that define these epic journeys. If you have enjoyed this journey through history, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this series with those who appreciate the hidden stories of human endurance. Thank you for sailing with us through these lost chapters. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg, transformed through original narration and storytelling to reconstruct the rhythms of a life once lived on the edge of the world. After weeks existing within the monochromatic salt-crusted world of the ship, the first contact with land is not just a change of scenery, it is a sensory assault. As the small boat pulls away from the ship and the keel finally grinds against the sand or mud of a new shore, the sailors experience a phenomenon that borders on the surreal. The air here has weight. It is filled with a complex layered sense of earth, vegetation, damp soil and blooming flora, a stark contrast to the sterile, sharp bite of ocean brine. For men whose olfactory landscape has been limited to wood, tar and wet wool, the sudden infusion of living smells is almost intoxicating. The visual experience is equally jarring. After staring for weeks at the seamless grey horizon, the eye is suddenly confronted with texture and depth. The jagged silhouettes of mountains, the tangled density of forests, and the vibrant varied greens and browns of untamed land. It takes time for the mind to process this complexity. The sailors step on the beach with a hesitant, almost fragile gait. Their bodies still anticipated the phantom roll of the deck. They walk slowly, often looking down at their feet, testing the solid, unyielding earth as if they fear it might give way beneath them. Language and communication also shift in this moment. The crew finds them in a space where their familiar nautical jargon, the shorthand of the rigging and the watch, is suddenly rendered useless. They are forced into a more primal form of interaction, gesture, facial expression and tone. Even the way they move among the local inhabitants or navigate the landscape is different. There is an instinctive caution, a heightened awareness of being foreign. in a place where they do not know the rules. Every sound, from the song of birds to the rustle of leaves, is filtered through their maritime sensitivity. They listen for cues of danger or hospitality with the same intensity they once used to listen for the shifting wind. This first shore leave is a threshold. It represents the end of their absolute isolation and the beginning of their role as observers in a new world. They are no longer just survivors navigating a void, they are explorers encountering the unknown. As they wander away from the landing site, the heavy psychological fog that defined their voyage begins to break apart, replaced by a sharp, nervous curiosity. They are here to gather, to rest, and to learn, but even in this moment of terrestrial relief, they remain anchored to their identity as sailors. They check the sky for weather, they note the tides, and they keep a watchful eye on the sea, knowing that while they are currently on solid ground, their bond to the ocean remains their defining characteristic. The journey has changed form, and for the first time in months, the future is not just another day at sea, but a horizon of new possibilities. In the absence of a shared tongue, the sailors and the local inhabitants turn to the universal language of trade. This a delicate dance of gesture, instinct, and mutual evaluation. When the crew approaches the shore to exchange items from their hold, iron tools, lengths of rope, or perhaps small carvings made during the night watches, they are not merely conducting commerce, they are negotiating trust. The sailors have learned that to be aggressive is to be vulnerable, and to be too passive is to be taken advantage of. They use their hands to mimic the function of an object, a pantomime that bridges the gap between their disparate cultures. The item they offer are the products of the ship's internal life. A bundle of finely tied knots, or a tool repaired with extra reinforcements, speaks to the local people of the sailor's competence and character. In return, they receive fresh produce, dried fruits, or woven baskets. This exchange is often slow and fraught with tension. Both sides watch the other's eyes, looking for signs of deception or hostility. It is a process of social navigation. The crew learns that a slight incline of the head, or a specific placement of goods on the ground, can signal peaceful intent, while abrupt movements are seen as threats. This trading process forces the sailors to shed their maritime insularity. They are no longer a closed system. They are vulnerable to the rhythms and values of the land. They notice that the local traders have a different perception of time and worth. For the sailors, a piece of metal is a tool that ensures survival. For the locals, it may be a rare curiosity or a valuable material for ornament. This misalignment of values requires the sailors to adapt. They must learn what the locals prioritize: fresh water, specific types of wood, or perhaps even the strange. Salt, crusted items they once considered waste, and realign their trading strategy accordingly. Through these interactions, a tenuous bond begins to form. They are not becoming friends in the traditional sense, but they are becoming acquaintances in survival. The sailors begin to recognize the faces of the local traders, learning who is fair and who is cunning. They develop a primitive code of conduct that governs these meetings. Don't bring weapons in the trading zone, keep the group small, and always ensure an exit path back to the boats. It is a masterful exercise in cross-cultural diplomacy, stripped of all artifice. Through this exchange, the crew realize that their survival on land is just as dependent on their ability to understand and respect the other, as it was on their ability to handle the rigging in a storm. They are building a temporary bridge between their isolated existence at sea and the vibrant, complex world of the land. To the sailors, the land is not just a destination. It is a living, breathing library of the unknown. Driven by a mix of genuine curiosity and the practical need to identify potential food sources, the crew begins to document the natural world around them. Their logs, scraps of parchment, or the back of old manifests become filled with crude but observant sketches. They describe trees that grow in shapes they have never seen, fruits with bitter rinds and sweet hearts, and animals that move with a grace completely foreign to the clumsy, heavy-footed life they are accustomed to. This recording process is a radical shift in perspective. On the ship, the crew only ever looked for the monsters of the deep, the storms, the shifting ice, the broken rigging. Now they are forced to look at the minute details, the veins on a leaf, the pattern of tracks in the mud, or the way a bird behaves when a storm is brewing. They develop a communal, observational shorthand. A sailor might point to a specific berry and tap his chest, then point to his stomach, a sign that the local traders have signaled it is safe to eat. They become amateur naturalists out of necessity, constantly testing, tasting, and categorizing the life around them. The most fascinating aspect of this activity is the awe it evokes. For men who have been hardened by the icy, barren expanse of the winter sea, the sheer abundance of the land is overwhelming. They find them lingering over a patch of wildflowers, or watching a colony of insects with a fascination that would seem childish to their land-dwelling counterparts. It is a form of healing, the complexity of the forest, the variety of the birds, and the textures of the soil provide a sensory richness that acts as an antidote to the hollow time they endured on the ocean. These logs, often written in shaky, salt-worn handwriting, serve as a testament to their humanity. They are not merely marking geography. They are attempting to make sense of a world that is no longer hostile. By giving names to the things they see, even if those names are merely descriptors like blue-feathered bird or spiny leaf tree, they domesticating the wild landscape, making it familiar enough to navigate. This habit of observation also sharpens their senses for the return journey. They begin to see the land as a collection of resources, realizing that the forest and the shore are as much a part of their survival strategy as the ship itself. It is a humbling realization. The ocean is the path, but the land is the cradle of life, and for the first time they understand the fragility and the wonder of both. As the crew spends more time ashore, they inevitably become silent witness to the rhythms of the local inhabitants' rituals that appear at first glance to be strange, yet reveal a deep underlying logic upon observation. They might see the people gather at dawn to face the rising sun, or hear a collective, rhythmic chant as they harvest the tide. The sailors, accustomed to the rigid mechanical rituals of ship life, the bell, the watch, the prayer for wind, find them struck by the profound communal nature of these terrestrial traditions. They learn to watch from a distance, standing still, hands behind their backs, out of a hard, learned respect for the sanctity of the unknown. There is unspoken agreement among the crew. They are guests in a space they do not fully comprehend. They see the locals treat the land with a reverence similar to how a sailor treats the sea. When the people leave offerings of fruit or stone at a specific tree, or perform a dance before casting their nets, the crew does not scoff. They recognize the impulse behind these acts. It is the same impulse that led them to murmur a prayer during a gale or touch a lucky charm before climbing the mast. It is a shared human acknowledgement of forces greater than oneself, a way to anchor one's existence against the whims of the natural world. Occasionally, the sailors are invited to join a meal or a gathering. These moments are profound. They sit on the ground, their stiff sea-worn bodies contrasting with the fluid movements of the locals. They share food, a taste of earth and fire, and listen to songs whose meaning they can't pass, but whose cadence they instinctively understand. They find that even without language they can participate in the emotional arc of a ritual, the solemnity of a blessing, the joy of a harvest, the shared grief of a funeral. These experiences peel away the last layers of the hardened sailor persona, revealing men who are, at their core, seeking connection. This exposure changes the crew's outlook. They begin to see that their own maritime life is just one way of existing in a vast, diverse reality. The rituals they observe, the way the locals celebrate the changing of the seasons or the birth of a child, provide a stark contrast to the singular, grim purpose of their survival-focused voyage. By observing these rites, the sailors are reminded of the civilization they left behind and the humanity they have fought so hard to keep intact. They return to the ship not just with supplies, but with a renewed sense of their place in the world. They realize that while they belong to the sea, they are fundamentally connected to the earth. And that respect for the sacred, whatever form it may take, is the glue that holds all human existence together. Water on the ship is never truly fresh. It is a stale iron, tasting liquid kept in wooden barrels that grow slimmer and more stagnant with every passing week. When the crew finally locates a true source of water on land, a bubbling mountain spring or a crystal-clear forest stream, the experience is transformative. They approach the source with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. For the first time in months, they are not dipping a bucket into a murky, dark hold. They are kneeling before the living earth, watching water emerge, pure and untainted, from the rock. The task of gathering water becomes the most coveted duty on shore leave. It is a slow, methodical process that requires absolute care. The sailors use clean skin bags and wooden casks, nuclear scrubbed and rinsed, to collect the liquid. They work in a silent trance-like state, listening to the rhythmic splash and the crisp, clear music of the flow. There is a primal satisfaction in this act. They wash their faces, scrubbing away the salt, crust that has defined their appearance. And for a few fleeting moments they feel clean, not just on the surface, but in a way that permeates their spirit. This source is the lifeblood of their return journey. They know that this water, once bottled and returned to the barrels, will be the difference between a sluggish, sickly transit and a vigorous, healthy one. They test the water cautiously, letting a small sip sit on the tongue, savouring the cool, sweet clarity, the taste of stone and sunlight. It is a stark reminder of what they have been missing, the sheer life-giving simplicity of nature. They fill the casks until they are heavy and strained, the weight of the water now a welcome burden compared to the hollow, light weight of empty containers. As they carry the casks back to the small boats, the crew moves with a sense of purpose and renewed strength. They have secured their survival for the next several weeks. This water source represents the land's final gift to them before they head back in the void of the ocean. It is a tether, a tangible piece of the earth that they will carry in the darkness of the ship's hold. Every time they drink from these barrels in the weeks to come, the taste will remind them of the forest, the cool shade, and the stillness of the shore. It is a secret, hidden treasure that restores their morale as much as it replenishes their bodies, preparing them for the long final stretch that lies ahead. The final phase of the shore leave is defined by the logistics of departure. The crew must now transform the abundance of the land into the compact, durable supplies needed for the voyage home. This is a deliberate, industrious process. They are not merely filling barrels, they are selecting items that will survive the damp, the darkness, and the motion of the sea. They dry fruits over low, controlled fires, smoke fish caught in the coastal shallows, and gather bundles of hardy herbs that can survive the transition to the ship hold. Every action is guided by the lesson learned from the previous months of scarcity. This provisioning is a collaborative effort involving the veterans who know exactly how much each man will consume, and the younger sailors who do the heavy lifting. They operate with a quiet, efficient rhythm. The ship's galley is stripped down, cleaned, and reorganized to accommodate the new inventory. There is a sense of investing in the future. They are packing not just food, but the morale-boosting taste of the land. A jar of dried berries or a pouch of aromatic leaves is not just sustenance. It is a reminder that they have survived, succeeded, and are now carrying the essence of the shore with them. The locals watch these preparations with interest, often tributed their own knowledge to the process. They might show the sailors which roots will stay fresh the longest, or how to wrap the goods in leaves to prevent rot. This cooperation turns the provisioning into a final, shared act of goodwill. The sailors are careful not to take too much, leaving the local stores balance and respecting the limits of the ecosystems that has supported them. They understand that their departure is final, and they want to leave behind a memory of fairness rather than a legacy of exploitation. As the last crates are lashed into the small boats, the crew feels a transition in their own internal state. The land eggs are fading, replaced by a subconscious anticipation of the ship's role. They have successfully traded, observed, and gathered, turning a foreign shore into a source of renewed life. Their cargo is now secured, the deck is ready, and the ship, once a site of hunger and cold, is now prepared to become their home once again. They have performed the necessary labour of survival, turning the bounty of the earth into the fuel for their journey. The hold is full, the gear is mended, and the crew stands ready, their eyes slowly turning from the lush colours of the forest back toward the distant, beckoning line of the horizon. Before the final departure, a quiet, informal exchange takes place that transcends the simple bartering of goods. The sailors, masters of ropes, pulleys and structure repair, begin to share their married skills with the local people who have shown them such hospitality. It is a gesture of profound gratitude. A veteran sailor spends an afternoon demonstrating how to splice a thick hemp line so that it never lips, or how to fashion a durable multi-purpose knot that can secure a heavy load. In return, the local artisans share their own secrets, how to weave grasses so they remain water-resistant, or how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, knowledge that is specific to this coast and vital for the local fishermen. This transfer of knowledge is a language all its own. It requires close observation and physical demonstration. A sailor guides the hand of a local man, showing him how to tension a thread, while a local fisherman shows a sailor how to identify the slight discoloration in the water that warns of a submerged reef. There is a deep mutual respect in this process. They are not merely swapping tools, they are sharing the wisdom of the craft. They recognize that the challenges of the sea and the challenges of the land require the same fundamental traits: patience, precision, and intuitive understanding of the natural world. For the crew, this exchange is a powerful reminder of their own worth. After months of feeling small and insignificant against the vast, indifferent ocean, being recognized as a craft reinforces their identity. It restores a sense of agency. They realize that they carry within them a wealth of technical knowledge that is valuable, and by passing it on, they leave a piece of them behind. They are not just survivors, they are contributors. This realization eases the transition back to the ship, They feel less like desperate refugees and more like accomplished navigators of the world. These final hours are filled with a strange, quiet dignity. The sailors see the locals use the knots they taught them, and the sailors find them using the navigation tips they were gifted. It creates a bond that will outlast their departure. When the time finally comes to board the small boats, there is a warmth in the handshakes and a sincerity in the farewells that was absent upon their arrival. They have not just taken what they needed to survive, they have enriched the world they visited, and in doing so, they have enriched themselves. They leave the shore not as strangers who happen to pass through, but as partners who have traded the most valuable commodity of all, the collective, hard-won knowledge of how to endure and thrive in a world that is always testing their resolve. As the final supplies are stowed and the last of the crew climbs aboard the waiting ship, a palpable, heavy silence settles over the deck. This is not the cold, oppressive silence of the mid, it is a weight of nostalgia. Over the past few weeks, the shore, once an alien, dangerous landscape, has become a sanctuary. The crew has grown accustomed to the stable ground, the varied diet, and the rhythmic, predictable life of the local community. Now, as they prepare to weigh anchor, they feel a strange, lingering attachment to the place they must inevitably leave behind. The men linger at the rails, looking back at the shoreline. They identify the landmarks they have come to know. The grove where they gathered fresh water, the beach where they traded, and the distant, familiar silhouettes of the local people who stand watching their departure. For a few hours, the urgency of the voyage is suspended. They are caught between two worlds, the one that defined their struggle and the one that offered them refuge. They realize that they will never see this place again, and the finality of that thought creates a shared, introspective mood. They are no longer the same men who arrived. They are softer perhaps, but also more reflective. This moment of nostalgia is a vital psychological transition. It allows them to process the transition from land back to the isolation of the ocean. By acknowledging their attachment to the shore, they are able to say goodbye, preparing their minds for the return to the ship, internal, focused reality. They share quiet memories with one another, a specific taste of a meal, a moment of connection with a local trader, the way the forest sounded at night. These are the treasures they carry in their hearts, even if their hands are empty. As the ship begins to groan with the tension of the anchor being raised, the crew moves with a new kind of intensity. The nostalgia is not allowed to become a distraction. It is channeled into their work. They know that to honour the sanctuary they found, they must ensure they navigate the return journey with the same competence and care they have always shown. They cast their last looks at the land, not with longing, but with a quiet hardened acceptance. They are sailors, and their place is on the water. They turn their backs to the shore, and their faces to the horizon, the ship's bow already cutting through the first swell of the open sea. The harbour fades in the distance, but the memory of the land remains, a glowing ember in the dark, cold expanse of their maritime life. The return to the open sea is a visceral, startling experience. As the ship leaves the shelter of the harbour and encounters the first true deep, ocean swells, the deck begins its familiar, rhythmic pitching. The crew, who had only days ago found stability on solid ground, must now undergo the re-seeing process. It is a physical and psychological adjustment that feels like shedding a skin. The muscles that had relaxed on land must suddenly tighten again. The eyes that had grown accustomed to the stationary horizon must now learn to anticipate the ship, erratic, wave-driven motion. This time, however, the mood on board is fundamentally altered. They are not the same crew that left home months ago. They are carrying the physical and psychological sustenance of their time ashore, the fresh water, the dried provisions, and the hard, won memories of a different way of life. The internal silence of the ship is no longer empty. It is filled with the echoes of their experiences. When they stand their watch, they are not just looking at the waves. They are looking toward home with a clarity and purpose that was missing before. They have successfully negotiated with the world, and they have won. There is a new quiet pride in their efficiency. Every task, from trimming the sails to navigating by the stars, is performed with a renewed sharpness. They are eager to complete the journey, but they are not frantic. The desperation that once plagued their movements has been replaced by a grim, confident, professional focus. They know the limits of their endurance, and they know the capabilities of their ship. They move with the synchronized precision of men who have survived the absolute worst and are now simply finishing the work they started. The transition is also marked by a subtle shift in their social dynamic. The bonds formed in the freezing, hungry, hollow times are now tempered by the warmth of their time on land. They talk more, not just of survival, but of the future. They discuss what they will do when they finally reach their home port, how they will describe the strange, lush world they discovered, and what parts of them's they have left behind. They are becoming more human again, less defined by the machine of the ship, and more by their shared humanity. The return voyage is not just a transit, it is the final act of their transformation. They are carrying the world back with them, and in doing so, they are prepared to face whatever lies between them and the shore. The end of the voyage is marked not by a sudden explosion of joy, but by the slow, deliberate rhythm of arrival. As the familiar coastline of home finally peers through the morning mist, the silence on deck is absolute. The crew stands at the rails, their faces weathered and scarred by the salt and the cold, watching as the harbour reveal itself. For weeks they have been ghosts in a grey, moving void. Now they are finally returning to a world that has a name, a history, and a destination. There is no cheering, only a profound collective exhale, a release of the tension that has kept their hearts beating and their hands working for months. When the anchor finally drops, the sound is final, a heavy metallic plunge that echoes across the water and signals the end of their isolation. The ship, which has been a living, breathing animal, suddenly goes still. The motion ceases. The constant, grinding protest of the timber, the rhythmic snapping of the sails, and the relentless hum of the ocean are replaced by the foreign, static sounds of the port. The sailors stand perfect still, waiting, as if the ship itself is hesitant to accept that the journey is truly over. They have lived for so long in a state of suspended animation that the reality of home is almost difficult to grasp. Disembarking is a surreal experience. As they step on the dock, their bodies are heavy, uncoordinated and trembling. They look at the people moving about on the land, men who have never known the hunger of a long winter at sea, who have never had to mend a sail in a gale, or have never measured their lives in the counting of the watch. The sailors walk with a strange, grounded dignity. They carry the weight of the journey in their eyes and the calluses on their hands, but they also carry something else, a quiet, unshakable knowledge. They have survived the unendurable. They have witnessed the beauty of distant shores, and they have returned as different men. As they finally turn away from the ship for the last time, the vessel sits at anchor, a scarred salt, bleach monument to their endurance. They do not look back with sorrow, but with a form of solemn reverence. The ship was their prison, their workplace, their school, and ultimately their saviour. They leave it behind, taking with them only the intangible lessons of their survival. They step in the city, blending back in the rhythm of daily life, but they will never be truly at home in the same way again. They are forever tethered to the horizon and the memory of the deep, cold sea. They have come home, but a part of them will always remain at sea, watching the wind, waiting for the bell to ring, and forever navigating the silent, majestic void of the world. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.